Beelzebub, the Lord of the Flies. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You're standing in an ancient temple, thousands of years old. The air is thick with incense and the metallic smell of blood. In front of you stands a massive bronze statue, gleaming in the firelight. Its eyes seem to follow you. Its mouth gapes open, revealing a furnace within. And all around you, the sound. The incessant, maddening buzz of thousands upon thousands of flies. This is the domain of Beelzebub, the Lord of the Flies, one of the most powerful and terrifying demons in human mythology. But here's what most people don't know. Before he became the demon that haunts our nightmares, he was worshipped as a god. Before Christianity painted him as the embodiment of evil, entire civilizations bowed before his altars. And the truth behind his transformation from deity to demon is far more disturbing than any horror movie could capture. Today, we're diving deep into one of the darkest rabbit holes in religious history. We're going to uncover who Beelzebub really was, why ancient peoples feared and revered him, how he became second only to Satan himself in the hierarchy of hell, and what the flies, those endless swarms of flies, actually represent. By the end of this video, you'll never look at religious history the same way again. And you'll understand why this particular demon has haunted humanity's collective nightmare for over 3,000 years. But I need to warn you, this story goes to places you might not expect. Places that challenge everything we think we know about good and evil, about gods and demons, about how history gets written by the victors. So if you're ready to descend into the shadows with me, let's begin. The name Beelzebub. Say it out loud. Beelzebub. There's something inherently unsettling about it, isn't there? The way it rolls off the tongue, like insects crawling across your skin. But that name, the one we know, is actually a corruption. A deliberate insult twisted into existence by those who sought to destroy what he once represented. To understand Beelzebub, we need to travel back in time. Way back. We're talking about the ancient Near East, around 1500 to 1200 BCE. Picture the landscape. The Mediterranean coastline, Bronze Age cities rising from the desert, temple complexes that would make modern architects weep with envy. This is the land of Canaan, and here, in the great cities of Phoenicia, a god was worshipped with a name that commanded respect and reverence. Baal Zebul, Lord of the High Place, Lord of the Heavenly Dwelling. Baal Zebul wasn't some minor deity in a crowded pantheon. He was one of the most powerful gods in the Canaanite religion. He was the storm god, the rainbringer, the one who controlled fertility and harvest. When crops flourished, it was Baal Zebul's blessing. When thunder rolled across the mountains, it was his voice. When rain came to end a drought, it was his mercy. In an agricultural society where survival depended entirely on the weather, you can imagine how much power this gave him. Temples were built in his honor across the ancient world. The city of Ekron, one of the 5 great Philistine cities, had a particularly famous temple dedicated to him. Pilgrims would travel for miles to seek his favor, to pray for rain, to ask for healing, to request victory in battle. But here's where it gets interesting. The ancient Israelites, who were developing their own monotheistic religion in the same region, saw these Canaanite gods as their primary competition. And not just spiritual competition. We're talking about real, political, cultural warfare. The Old Testament is filled with stories of Israelite kings backsliding, building altars to Baal, and worshiping the Canaanite deities. The prophet Elijah's entire ministry was essentially a campaign against Baal worship. He challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a divine showdown on Mount Carmel. You might remember the story. 2 altars, 2 sacrifices. Whichever god sent fire from heaven would prove himself real. Baal's prophets prayed and danced and cut themselves for hours. Nothing happened. Then Elijah prayed once, and fire consumed his sacrifice, the altar, and even the water in the trenches around it. Now, whether you believe that story literally or metaphorically doesn't matter for our purposes. What matters is what it tells us about the intensity of this religious conflict. The Israelites weren't just rejecting Baal. They were actively working to discredit him, to transform him in the cultural consciousness from a powerful god to something else entirely. And this is where the name change comes in. Baal Zebul, Lord of the High Place, became Baal Zebub. And that tiny change, from Zebul to Zebub, that was the most devastating insult imaginable. Because Zebub means flies. Baal Zebub, Lord of the Flies. Can you imagine the psychological warfare of that? Taking your enemy's most powerful god and renaming him after insects, after pests, after creatures associated with death, decay, and filth. It would be like if a rival nation today started calling your president the commander of garbage. The mockery is built right into the name. And this insult appears in the Hebrew Bible itself. In 2 Kings chapter 1, when King Ahaziah of Israel is injured and sends messengers to consult Baal Zebub, the god of Ekron, about whether he'll recover. The prophet Elijah intercepts them with a message from the Israelite God. Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Baal Zebub, the god of Ekron? The contempt drips from every word. But here's what's fascinating. The insult worked so well that Baal Zebub, this mocking nickname, actually replaced the original name in popular consciousness. Over centuries, as the Israelite religion evolved into Judaism, and as Christianity emerged from Judaism, Baal Zebub stopped being the name of a pagan god and became the name of a demon of such power and evil that he would become second in command to Satan himself in the Christian tradition. The transformation was complete. The Lord of the High Place had become the Lord of the Flies. And those flies would take on meanings that the original name callers could never have imagined. Now, before we go deeper into how Beelzebub became the demon we know today, we need to talk about what he might have actually represented in his original form. Because here's something that might surprise you. The Canaanite religion wasn't just primitive superstition. These people were sophisticated. They had complex theological systems, rich mythologies, and their gods represented real philosophical concepts. Baal wasn't just a weather god. He represented order emerging from chaos. In Canaanite mythology, Baal defeats Yam, the god of the sea and chaos, establishing cosmic order. He defeats Mot, the god of death and the underworld, ensuring the cycle of seasons continues. He's a dying and rising god, a vegetation deity who descends into death each year and returns each spring, bringing life back to the earth. Does any of that sound familiar? It should, because these same themes, this death and resurrection motif, this idea of a God who brings life from death, these concepts show up all over ancient Near Eastern religion. And yes, they influenced the development of Christianity too. The early church fathers knew this. They had to deal with critics who pointed out that the Jesus story had elements in common with older pagan myths. Their solution? Those similarities were placed there by demons to create confusion, to anticipate and mock the true revelation. Think about the logic of that. If your religion has similarities to older religions, just claim that the similarities were demonic precognition. It's actually brilliant from a theological perspective. And it also meant that gods like Baal, who had these similar themes, needed to be definitively recast as demonic. They couldn't be allowed to remain as competing deities. They had to become enemies, servants of Satan, part of the army of darkness. By the time we get to the New Testament, written in Greek, the name has evolved again. Beelzebul appears in the Gospels. Jesus himself is accused by the Pharisees of casting out demons by the power of Beelzebub, the prince of demons. Let that sink in. Baal Zebul, the Canaanite storm god who brought rain and fertility, has now become the prince of demons, the commander of evil spirits, the right hand of Satan. And Jesus responds with one of his most famous teachings. If Satan casts out Satan, he is divided against himself. How then will his kingdom stand? The argument is logical, but notice what's happened in the cultural consciousness. Beelzebub is now unquestionably demonic, unquestionably evil. There's no ambiguity left. The transformation is complete. But we still haven't addressed the flies. Why flies? What is it about flies that made this insult stick so effectively? And why did the demonic imagery of Beelzebub become so intensely associated with these insects? To understand that, we need to understand what flies meant in the ancient world. In a time before refrigeration, before modern sanitation, flies were everywhere. They swarmed over meat in the marketplace. They clustered on wounds. They gathered in clouds around the sick and dying. Most importantly, they were the primary insects associated with dead bodies. A corpse would be covered in flies within hours. Their larvae, maggots, would consume flesh with horrifying efficiency. Flies were the visible agents of decay, of corruption, of the transformation from life to death. In a very real sense, they were death made visible, and there was no escape from them. In the desert heat of the ancient Near East, during the summer months, flies were a constant torment. They crawled on food, on skin, into eyes and noses and mouths. Ancient texts from the region frequently mention flies as one of the great plagues, one of the primary sources of misery. The 8th plague of Egypt in the book of Exodus is flies, filling the houses of Egyptians so completely that the land is ruined by them. So when the Israelites renamed Baal Zebul as Baal Zebub, they weren't just making a random insult. They were associating him with plague, with death, with corruption, with inescapable torment. They were saying, your God isn't a lord of high places. He's a lord of rot, a lord of disease, a lord of everything that defile and destroys. And as Beelzebub's legend grew in Jewish and Christian tradition, those flies came with him. Medieval demonology, which we'll get to in more detail shortly, describes Beelzebub as surrounded by flies. He appears in a swarm of them. He sends them as plagues. He is, in many accounts, massive beyond imagining and covered entirely in flies. They crawl over his body like a living garment. They pour from his mouth when he speaks. In some traditions, he doesn't just command flies. He is flies. He's a collective entity, a hive mind of millions of insects moving with a singular malevolent purpose. Try to imagine encountering that. A demon the size of a building, its form barely visible beneath a coating of countless insects, the buzzing so loud it drowns out thought, and as it moves toward you, flies break off in swarms and fill the air, blacking out the sun. But there's another layer to the fly symbolism that's even more disturbing when you dig into it. Flies, particularly in medieval and Renaissance thought, were associated with obsessive, intrusive thoughts. Have you ever had a thought you couldn't get rid of? An anxious worry that circles in your mind, landing again and again, no matter how many times you try to dismiss it? That's why we call them intrusive thoughts. The medieval theologians and demonologists noticed this parallel. Flies that buzz around your head, that land on you repeatedly, no matter how many times you swat them away, behave exactly like certain types of thoughts and temptations. The Latin term for this was cogitations muscae, literally fly thoughts. And who was the master of these tormenting, persistent, filthy thoughts? Beelzebub, the lord of the flies. This is where Beelzebub's role in Christian demonology becomes really specific. He's not just generically evil. He's the demon of obsessive sin, of persistent temptation, of thoughts that corrupt from within. He's associated particularly with pride, with vanity, with the kind of sin that buzzes constantly at the edge of consciousness, never fully going away. In this interpretation, Every fly you see becomes a potential reminder of demonic presence. Every buzzing insect is a small manifestation of Beelzebub's power, a tiny servant of the prince of demons. Imagine living in a world where you believe that, where every fly was literally a demonic entity. The psychological impact would be enormous. And that's exactly what made Beelzebub such an effective demon in Christian teaching. He was everywhere, unavoidable, constantly present, always reminding you of your vulnerability to sin and corruption. Now, let's jump forward to the real golden age of Beelzebub's development as a demonic figure, the medieval period and the Renaissance. This is when demonology became a serious, systematic study in Christian Europe. We're talking about detailed hierarchies of hell, classifications of demons, grimoires, and magical texts that claim to map the entire infernal realm. And in these systems, Beelzebub's status rose to extraordinary heights. In many medieval schemes, he's not just a powerful demon. He's the second in command of all hell, directly below Satan himself. Some texts even suggest he was Satan's second in command before the fall, the highest of the angels after Lucifer himself. When Lucifer rebelled and was cast down, Beelzebub fell with him, becoming the chief lieutenant in the war against heaven. The Lantern of Light, a 15th century English text, calls Beelzebub the devil next to Lucifer. Johann Weyer's Pseudomonarchia Daemonum, published in 1577, ranks him as the supreme chief of the infernal empire, founder of the Order of the Fly. Think about that title. Founder of the Order of the Fly. It's taking the insult, the mockery, and transforming it into something grandiose and terrifying. Beelzebub has embraced the flies, made them his symbol, his army, his very essence. The Dictionnaire Infernal, published in 1818, describes Beelzebub as commanding 66 legions of demons. A legion in Roman military terms was around 5,000 soldiers. We're talking about 330,000 demons under his direct command. And that's just his personal forces. As second in command of hell, he theoretically has authority over all demons except Satan himself. But different traditions give Beelzebub different roles and characteristics. And this is where things get really interesting. In some accounts, he's the demon of pride, the sin that caused Lucifer's fall and remains the most dangerous of all sins. In others, he's the demon of gluttony, of excessive consumption, of appetites that can never be satisfied. The flies fit this interpretation too, constantly seeking, never satisfied, always hungry. The grimoires, those medieval magical texts that claim to teach sorcery, gave specific instructions for summoning Beelzebub. And let me be clear, we are not going to provide actual summoning instructions here. But the descriptions in these texts are fascinating from a historical and psychological perspective. Beelzebub, they say, appears in different forms depending on the summoner and the ritual. Sometimes he manifests as a fly of enormous size, sometimes as a handsome soldier or nobleman, sometimes as a grotesque monster, part human, part insect, with wings that buzz and create windstorms. The most detailed grimoire descriptions come from texts like the Lesser Key of Solomon and the Grand Grimoire. They describe elaborate precautions necessary to summon Beelzebub safely. Circles of protection, specific prayers, the names of God written in particular patterns. Because Beelzebub is so powerful, so cunning, that he will destroy or possess any summoner who shows the slightest weakness. These texts were taken deadly seriously. People believed that demons were real, that they could be summoned, and that Beelzebub was one of the most dangerous entities in existence. The very act of speaking his name was considered risky. You might attract his attention. You might bring flies. You might open yourself to possession. And possession, that's another crucial part of Beelzebub's legend. In Christian tradition, demons can possess human beings, controlling their bodies, speaking through their mouths, causing suffering and madness. Beelzebub, as prince of demons, was considered especially skilled at this. Exorcism manuals from the Catholic Church specifically name him as one of the most difficult demons to expel from a possessed person. There are recorded accounts, going back centuries, of exorcisms where the possessing demon identified itself as Beelzebub. In the famous case of the Loudun possessions in France in the 1630s, nuns claimed to be possessed by multiple demons, with Beelzebub named as one of the chief entities controlling them. The case became a massive scandal, leading to public exorcisms, political intrigue, and eventually the execution of a priest accused of causing the possessions through witchcraft. Whether you believe these possessions were real demonic activity, psychological phenomena, or outright fraud, the fact remains that Beelzebub's name carried immense power. To say you were possessed by Beelzebub was to claim the most serious possible spiritual affliction. It meant the second most powerful being in hell had personally chosen to inhabit your body. It meant you were at the center of cosmic warfare. And it meant the church had to take you very, very seriously. There's a psychological brilliance to how effective Beelzebub became as a figure of terror. Unlike Satan, who's abstract and distant in most theology, Beelzebub had a visceral, immediate presence. The flies made him tangible. Every time you encountered flies, especially in swarms, you could imagine you were in his presence. Every time an intrusive thought buzzed in your mind, you could attribute it to his influence. He was Satan with a physical manifestation. Evil you could see and hear and feel crawling on your skin. Now, we need to address something that might be bothering you. We've talked about Beelzebub as if he's real, as if these medieval and Renaissance people were interacting with an actual entity. But was there anything to it? Is there any reality behind the legend? Or is Beelzebub purely a creation of human imagination, a boogeyman constructed from religious conflict and psychological projection? That's a question everyone has to answer for themselves based on their own beliefs. But what we can say objectively is that Beelzebub, whether real or not, has had real effects on history. Real people have been executed as witches because they were accused of dealing with him. Real exorcisms have been performed. Real religious movements have defined themselves in opposition to him. Real art, literature, and culture have been shaped by his legend. Let's talk about that cultural impact, because Beelzebub didn't stay confined to religious texts and grimoires. He broke out into literature, into art, into popular culture, and every appearance reinforced and expanded his legend. John Milton's Paradise Lost, published in 1667, is probably the single most influential literary treatment of demons in the English language. And in Paradise Lost, Beelzebub is Satan's right-hand demon, his chief counselor, the one who speaks second at the great council in hell after Satan himself. Milton portrays him as cunning and intelligent, but also as having a kind of melancholy dignity. He's fallen from the highest heights to the deepest depths, and he knows it. Milton's Beelzebub is complex. He's not just a monster. He's a person, or at least a person-like entity, capable of thought and feeling and regret. That portrayal influenced every depiction of Beelzebub that came after. It made him literary. It made him dramatic. It made him, in a strange way, sympathetic. You could understand Milton's Beelzebub even as you feared him. And that made him even more effective as a character because the most terrifying villains aren't mindless monsters. They're intelligent beings who chose evil for reasons we can almost understand. If Milton was the most influential literary treatment, William Golding's Lord of the Flies is the most famous modern reinvention of the concept. Published in 1954, it's the story of British schoolboys stranded on an island who descend into savagery. The title is a direct reference to Beelzebub, and in the novel, The Lord of the Flies manifests as a pig's head on a stick, covered in flies, speaking to the protagonist, Simon, in a hallucination or vision. What Golding does is brilliant. He takes Beelzebub out of the realm of supernatural demonology and makes him a symbol of the evil within human nature. The Lord of the Flies tells Simon that he's inside all the boys, that he's part of them, that there's no escaping him. He represents the capacity for cruelty, for violence, for the breakdown of civilization that exists in every person. In Golding's vision, Beelzebub isn't an external demon you can fight. He's the darkness inside you. And that might be even more terrifying than the traditional version. Because if Beelzebub is external, you can resist him, banish him, and protect yourself from him. But if he's internal, if he's part of human nature itself, then the only defense is constant vigilance against your own impulses. The flies, in this reading, are the thoughts and impulses that buzz around in every human mind, the capacity for evil that we all carry. Beyond literature, Beelzebub appears constantly in popular culture. Movies, TV shows, comics, video games, they all draw on his legend. Sometimes he's portrayed as a literal demon, a monster to be fought. Sometimes he's a symbol, a metaphor for corruption and evil. The horror film The Exorcist, while not directly about Beelzebub, draws heavily on the tradition of demonic possession that he's central to. The demon Pazuzu in that film behaves very much like medieval accounts of Beelzebub, tormenting its victim with invasive thoughts and obscene impulses. In Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett's Good Omens, Beelzebub appears as the Lord of the Flies, portrayed as bureaucratic and irritable, surrounded by an ever-present cloud of insects. It's a comedic take, but even comedy can't quite remove the unsettling nature of the image. A sentient swarm of flies pretending to be a person is disturbing, no matter the tone. Video games love Beelzebub because he's visual. He's got a built-in aesthetic. The fly motif gives designers something concrete to work with. In the Shin Megami Tensei and Persona series, Beelzebub appears as a recurring demon, usually portrayed as insect-like, grotesque, and incredibly powerful. In Helltaker, a puzzle game, he's reinterpreted yet again, given new characteristics while maintaining the core fly theme. Each of these appearances, whether in high literature or pop culture, reinforces the legend. They keep Beelzebub alive in cultural consciousness. They ensure that the Lord of the Flies remains recognizable, remains frightening, and remains relevant. But here's something most people never think about. Every cultural appearance also changes the legend slightly. Milton gave Beelzebub dignity. Golding made him psychological. Modern media makes him visual, emphasizing the body horror of the flies. Over time, these changes accumulate. The Beelzebub of the 21st century is not quite the same as the Beelzebub of medieval demonology, who himself was not quite the same as the Baal Zebub of 2 Kings, who was completely different from the original Baal Zebul of Canaanite religion. It's evolution, cultural evolution of a mythological entity across 3,000 years. And that evolution is still happening. Right now, in writers' rooms and art studios and game development companies, people are creating new versions of Beelzebub, new interpretations, new angles, and each one adds to the legend, keeps it growing, keeps it changing. So let's get philosophical for a moment. What does Beelzebub represent, really? What is it about this particular demon that has given him such staying power? I think it comes down to a few core elements that resonate with deep human fears and experiences. First, there's the fear of invasion. Flies invade your space, your food, your body. They get into everything. You can't keep them out. Similarly, Beelzebub represents the fear that evil can invade you, can get inside you, can corrupt you from within. Possession is the ultimate violation, the ultimate loss of control over yourself. Second, there's the fear of persistence. You swat a fly, and another appears. You kill that one, and 10 more come. Evil, in the form of Beelzebub, is endless. It keeps coming back. You can never completely defeat it, never fully escape it. Third, there's the fear of the swarm. One fly is annoying. 1,000 flies is nightmare fuel. There's something about collective threats, about being overwhelmed by sheer numbers, that touches a primal fear in humans. Beelzebub, as a swarm entity, represents being overwhelmed, being consumed by something vast and uncaring. Fourth, and this is the subtle one, there's the association with decay. Flies remind us that our bodies are temporary, that we will die, that we will rot, that the boundary between life and death is thinner than we'd like to think. Beelzebub forces us to confront mortality, to acknowledge that corruption and decay are part of existence. That's heavy stuff. That's existential dread condensed into a mythological figure. And finally, there's the inversion of the sacred. Remember, Beelzebub started as a god, a storm god, a bringer of rain and life. His transformation into a demon of corruption and death represents the darkest possible fall. It symbolizes the perversion of the good, the corruption of the holy, the idea that anything, no matter how high or pure, can be twisted into its opposite. That's a terrifying thought. It suggests that nothing is safe, nothing is secure, nothing is beyond the reach of corruption. These themes, invasion, persistence, the swarm, decay, and the inversion of the sacred, these are why Beelzebub endures. He's not just scary because he's a powerful demon. He's scary because he represents aspects of existence that genuinely frighten us, aspects we can't fully escape or deny. Now, before we wrap up, I want to talk about one more thing. The modern perspective on Beelzebub and figures like him. Because we live in a different world than the medieval Christians who developed this legend. Most people in developed countries don't literally believe in demon possession anymore. We have psychology to explain mental illness. We have science to explain natural phenomena. We understand that flies are just insects, not spiritual entities. So what happens to Beelzebub in a post-religious or less religious age? Does he become irrelevant? Actually, no. If anything, he becomes more relevant, just in a different way. Because the things Beelzebub represents are still with us. We still have intrusive thoughts. We still struggle with obsessive, destructive patterns of thinking. We still feel invaded by negative emotions and impulses we can't control. We still experience what medieval theologians would have called spiritual warfare, even if we use different language to describe it. Modern psychology might call it anxiety, depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, addiction, or trauma responses. But the experience of feeling controlled by something other than your rational self, of being unable to stop destructive patterns, of feeling swarmed by thoughts you don't want, that's universal. That's human. Beelzebub, in this context, becomes a metaphor. Not literally a demon, but a representation of the demons we all carry. The Lord of the Flies becomes the Lord of the mental patterns that buzz endlessly in our heads, that we can't quite swat away, that feed on our psychological decay. Seen this way, Beelzebub is actually more relevant than ever. Because while fewer people believe in literal demons, everyone understands the experience of being tormented by your own mind. There's also been an interesting development in some modern occult and esoteric communities. Some practitioners have attempted to reclaim Beelzebub, to strip away the Christian demonization and connect with what they see as his original pre-Christian nature. They argue that Baal Zebul was a powerful deity who was unfairly vilified, and that working with Beelzebub today can mean connecting with ancient wisdom and power that predates Christian theology. I'm not here to endorse or condemn that perspective, but it's fascinating as a historical phenomenon. It represents yet another evolution of the Beelzebub concept, Another layer added to 3,000 years of transformation. From Canaanite storm god to Hebrew insult to Christian archdemon to psychological metaphor to reclaimed pagan deity. The journey is extraordinary. And here's the thing that really gets me. Throughout all these transformations, the flies remain. That single image, that buzzing cloud of insects, has survived every reinterpretation. It's the constant. It's the thread that connects ancient Baal Zebub to modern Beelzebub. Why? Because it's visceral. Because it's immediate. Because everyone, regardless of culture or religion or time period, knows what flies are, knows how they behave, knows the discomfort, the disgust, the hint of fear they inspire. The genius of the original Hebrew insult, Baal Zebub, was choosing an image so universal and so negative that it would stick for millennia. And it worked. It worked better than the name callers could possibly have imagined. They wanted to mock a rival god. They ended up creating one of the most enduring figures in the entire Western tradition of demonology. Think about the implications of that. The Israelite priests and prophets who first used the term Baal Zebub had no idea they were creating something that would last 3,000 years. They didn't know their insult would be incorporated into the New Testament. They certainly didn't know it would become central to medieval Christian demonology, or that it would inspire Renaissance art, or that it would feature in 20th century literature and 21st century video games. They just wanted to discredit a rival deity. And in doing so, they ensured that the deity would never be forgotten. There's a deep irony there. Baal Zebul might have faded into obscurity like countless other ancient Near Eastern gods. But by turning him into Beelzebub, by making him demonic, they made him immortal. They gave him the kind of eternal existence that gods dream of. And that brings us to one final, unsettling question. If Beelzebub was real, if there actually was a conscious entity behind the legend, would he be pleased with his transformation? Think about it. From one perspective, being turned from a god into a demon looks like a defeat. You're vilified, demonized, and made into an enemy of everything good. But from another perspective, you've achieved something remarkable. You've become more feared than you ever were as a god. You've penetrated multiple religious traditions. You've become archetypal, symbolic, bigger than any single culture or time period. Your name is known worldwide. Your image inspires art and stories. People still speak of you with a mixture of fascination and dread 3,000 years later. Isn't that a kind of victory? Isn't that, in a twisted way, a kind of immortality more powerful than being a local storm god could ever achieve? I'm not saying Beelzebub is real and consciously chose this path. But as a thought experiment, it's fascinating. What if being demonized was the best thing that ever happened to him? What if the Lord of the Flies embraced his new identity because it gave him more power, more reach, more presence in human consciousness than he ever had as Baal Zebul? What if the buzzing of the flies is actually laughter at the cosmic joke? The mockery became majesty. The insult became identity. The attempt to destroy became apotheosis. If there's a conscious intelligence behind the Beelzebub legend, it must be extraordinarily pleased with how things turned out. But whether Beelzebub is real or purely mythological, whether he's a demon or a metaphor or a cultural construct, one thing is undeniable. He matters. He's mattered for 3,000 years, and he shows no signs of becoming irrelevant. New stories about him are created every year. New interpretations emerge constantly. New people discover his legend and are fascinated, disturbed, and inspired. The Lord of the Flies continues his work, whatever that work might be. Maybe that work is spiritual, the corruption of souls, and the spread of evil. Maybe it's psychological, the manifestation of our darkest impulses and fears. Maybe it's purely cultural, the evolution of a story that helps us make sense of aspects of existence we struggle to understand. Or maybe, just maybe, It's all three at once. So where does that leave us? What do we take away from this deep dive into one of history's most persistent demons? I think we take away a recognition that the line between gods and demons is thinner than we often acknowledge. That religious history is written by victors who reshape the past to serve present purposes. That the most powerful symbols are those that touch something universal in human experience, something visceral and undeniable. And that whether we believe in literal demons or not, we all struggle with forces that feel beyond our control. Forces that invade our thoughts, that persist despite our resistance, that swarm us when we're vulnerable, that remind us of our mortality and fragility. Forces that, for 3,000 years, humans have found it useful to call by a name. Beelzebub, the Lord of the Flies. Next time you see a fly, really look at it. Watch how it moves, how it evades your hand, how it keeps coming back, how it lands where you don't want it, how it goes straight for food, for wounds, for anything decaying. Think about how many flies have existed in human history. Trillions upon trillions of them, each one buzzing, each one persistent, each one a tiny reminder of the aspects of existence we'd rather ignore. And think about the fact that somewhere, at some point, someone looked at those insects and saw divinity. And someone else looked at those same insects and saw the perfect insult for an enemy god. And that insult became a legend. And that legend became a demon. And that demon became immortal. That's the story of Beelzebub. From god to insect, to demon, to metaphor, to cultural icon. 3,000 years of evolution, all buzzing in the background of human consciousness like an endless swarm of flies we can never quite escape. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. Maybe we need figures like Beelzebub. Maybe we need names for the things that frighten us, the things that corrupt us, the things that buzz endlessly at the edge of our awareness. Maybe calling those things by a name, even a name born from ancient religious warfare, gives us a way to confront them, to talk about them, to recognize them for what they are. Or maybe that's exactly what Beelzebub wants us to think. Maybe giving the darkness a name and a form is the first step toward welcoming it in. Maybe the Lord of the Flies is most dangerous when we think we understand him, when we think we've reduced him to metaphor and symbol and cultural artifact. Maybe the real power of Beelzebub is that you can never quite tell whether he's real or not, whether he's out there or in here, whether the buzzing is external or internal, whether you're analyzing a legend or being slowly, subtly influenced by the very thing you're studying. That ambiguity, that uncertainty, that's the final lesson of Beelzebub. The most persistent demons, the ones that survive across millennia, are the ones that live in the spaces between belief and skepticism, between the real and the symbolic, between the external and the internal. They're the ones that adapt to every age, that find new forms while maintaining their essential nature. They're the ones that never quite die because they never were quite alive. They're the ones that buzz forever at the edge of human consciousness, like flies that can never be fully swatted away. And whether that's because they're genuine spiritual entities or because they represent something fundamental about the human condition is a question each person has to answer for themselves. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows. Thank you for descending with me into the realm of the Lord of the Flies. If this video made you think, if it unsettled you, if it gave you a new perspective on the intersection of religion, mythology, psychology, and culture, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. This channel is all about exploring the deep, dark, fascinating places where history, mythology, and human nature intersect. We're going places most content creators won't touch, asking questions that don't have easy answers, and trying to understand why certain stories have power over us. If that sounds like your kind of content, you belong here. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and join this community of people who aren't afraid to stare into the abyss and see what stares back. And let me know in the comments what you think. Do you believe in Beelzebub as a literal entity? As a psychological phenomenon? As pure mythology? Do you think the ancient Israelites knew what they were creating when they invented the Lord of the Flies? Have you ever experienced something you couldn't explain, something that felt like an invasion, like your thoughts weren't entirely your own? I read every comment, and the discussions on this channel are often as enlightening as the videos themselves. Let's talk about this stuff. Let's explore these questions together, because that's how we learn, how we grow, how we confront the things that frighten us. Together, in community, with honesty and open minds. There are more stories like this one waiting to be told. More demons and gods and mythological figures with histories stranger than you imagine. More journeys into the places where the sacred and the profane blur together. More questions about the nature of evil, the construction of religious history, and the symbols that haunt human consciousness across millennia. This is just the beginning. Stay with me for the journey. Subscribe. And remember, the next time you hear buzzing, the next time you see flies gathering, you'll know the name of their Lord. You'll know his history, his transformation, his power. Whether that knowledge protects you or makes you more vulnerable, well, that's something you'll have to discover for yourself. Until next time, stay curious, stay questioning, and watch out for the flies. They're always watching, always waiting, always buzzing just out of sight. The Lord of the Flies never rests, and neither should we.